The distress signal came from nothing. That was the first wrong thing. Commander Sierra Vasquez had been in the Ranger Corps long enough to know that distress signals came from ships, or stations, or the spinning debris of what used to be one or the other. They carried identifiers, transponder codes, the digital fingerprint of whoever was screaming into the dark. This one carried nothing. Just raw carrier wave, pulsing on a frequency the Rangers hadn't used in 20 years, from a coordinate that every chart in the Interstellar Alliance listed as empty space. She stood at the navigation console of the Ardavari and stared at the signal's origin point the way you might stare at a locked door you knew shouldn't be able to open itself. "Kit," she said to the young Minbari at comms, "run it again." "I've run it 6 times, Commander." His voice was careful. "The signal is real. The coordinate is real. What isn't there is anything that should be generating it." Sierra set her jaw. 14 years of service. The tail end of the Shadow War, the Reconstruction years, 3 postings to the outer boundary where strange things happened with a frequency that kept her from sleeping well. She was not easily unsettled. She was unsettled now. "Helm set a course, 1/4 speed." Her first officer, a Minbari named Duleth, appeared at her elbow like a shadow that had learned to express quiet disapproval. "The mission parameters from the Council specify the diplomatic convoy. We are already 2 hours behind our escort window. And there's a distress signal. From nothing. From something we can't see yet." She turned to face him fully. There was something she'd learned about Duleth in the 2 years they'd served together, which was that he respected directness more than rank. "If it's a false signal, we'll know in 20 minutes and we'll be 20 minutes behind schedule. If it's not..." She let the sentence sit unfinished between them. Duleth was quiet for a moment, then 20 minutes. The Ardavari was not a beautiful ship. She was a Ranger attack vessel, designation class Kolshara, 22 years old, jury-rigged with parts from 4 different hull types over her service life, and showing every one of her years in the gray modeling on her hull plates and the faint tremor in her port thruster. She'd carried for 8 months while supply requisitions languished somewhere in the bureaucratic gut of Minbar's logistics division. She was cramped and cantankerous, and her crew of 11 had learned to love her the way you learn to love things that have tried to kill you and failed. Sierra had not asked for the Ardavari. She had been offered the Kolvari, a new-build cruiser with integrated weapons systems and a full medical bay, fresh off the construction platform at Tuzener. She had declined it. The story that circulated, which she neither confirmed nor denied, was that she'd looked at the Kolvari's polished hull and new paint smell and said, "Give me a ship that already knows how to bleed." What she had actually said was somewhat more profane, but the sentiment was accurate enough. The Ardavari dropped to sublight 300,000 kilometers from the signal's source, and for 30 seconds nobody on the bridge said anything, because there was nothing to say. The ship was there. It was Ranger. That much was clear from its basic silhouette, from the angular Minbari-derived hull geometry, from the faint residue of crystalline organic hull material that the sensors were picking up in degraded fragments. It was tumbling slowly, nose over stern, the way a ship tumbles when its stabilizers are gone and nothing is telling it which way is down. Its hull was dark. No running lights. No transponder. The geometry of its damage was wrong in a way that Sierra couldn't immediately articulate. Not the clean gouges of weapons fire, not the jagged ruin of a collision, but something that looked almost like the ship had been grabbed and compressed and then released. "Transponder?" she asked. "Negative," Kit said. Then a moment later in a different voice, "Commander, the hull configuration I'm cross-referencing with the registry database. I think..." He stopped. "Kit. ISV Terranal, Commander, Ranger attack vessel. Lost on patrol 8 months ago with all hands." His voice had gone very flat, which Sierra had learned was his version of shaken. They were officially listed as destroyed at the Kalshen crossing. The Kalshen crossing was 40 light-years from here. Any life signs? I'm not. A pause. The kind of pause that meant the sensors were returning information that his brain was having trouble routing into language. I'm reading something. Not human. Not Minbari. Not any biometric signature in my database. It's on the aft section of the hull. On the hull outside. Yes. Sierra looked at the tumbling ship on the main screen. She looked at it for a long time. Suit up, she said. I'm going over. The figure was human. That was what she saw when she cleared the Ardavari's airlock and fired her suit's maneuvering thrusters toward the Terranal's drifting bulk. A figure in a Ranger pressure suit, arms spread, back against the hull, secured by some method she couldn't identify from a distance. The suit was standard-issue core gray. The helmet's visor was polarized. She was dead. She had to be dead. 8 months in open space. Sierra closed the distance anyway, because the Rangers had a code about these things, and also because the distress signal was still pulsing, and it was pulsing in exact synchrony with something on the suit's sleeve. A small device she'd never seen before, jury-rigged to the suit's comm system with what looked like cables stripped from the Terranal's interior conduit. The figure was breathing. The suit's bio-readout display was barely functional, flickering, reading low O2 and core temperature at the outer survivable margin, but breathing. Sierra's hands moved on instinct, checking the suit's oxygen supply, finding it empty, the recycler somehow still cycling on reserves that shouldn't have existed, as if the suit itself had been doing something impossible to keep the person inside it alive. She connected her own suit's emergency supply line and watched the bio-readout stabilize. The figure breathed in, out, in. Then slowly, the hand came up and touched the helmet release. Sierra caught the wrist. Don't nod out here. A pause, then a nod, a small, exhausted movement. They got her aboard. The woman's name was Captain Irale Kayla, and she had been dead for 8 months according to every official record the Interstellar Alliance possessed. She had commanded the Terranal. Her rank insignia was still on her suit's sleeve, slightly melted at the edges, which Sierra noticed and did not comment on. She was Minbari, warrior caste, bone crest partly shattered on the right side, an old injury that had healed rough. She was maybe 40 years standard, which in Minbari terms was still young. Her eyes, when she finally opened them in the Ardavari's small medical bay, were the pale silver of deep winter frost, and they tracked across the ceiling with the focused deliberateness of someone cataloging everything they could see from a lying-down position before committing to sitting up. Sierra sat in the single chair beside the bunk. She said nothing. She had found over the years that people who had been through something serious needed approximately 60 seconds of silence before they could talk about it, and that pushing before those 60 seconds were up cost you more time than it saved. At 47 seconds, Kayla said, in accented but precise standard, "How far are we from the Kalshen transit point?" "About 40 light-years. A very small pause, then they moved my ship. "Who did?" Kayla's silver eyes found Sierra's face. "I need to know who you are before I answer that question. Rank, service record, chain of loyalty." It was an odd thing to ask. It was also, Sierra recognized, a reasonable thing to ask if you had been through something serious enough to make you careful about who you trusted. She told her, rank, years of service, direct command chain, the number of her Ranger identification seal. She recited it the way you recited the Ranger oath, not as data but as something you meant. Kayla listened. Then she said, "One of my crew was passing information to them, to the ones who came for us. He was embedded before our last posting, I don't know by how long. He used the communications equipment to lead them to us. By the time I understood what was happening, they had killed 11 of my people, and I had managed to seal myself into a pressure suit and get outside the ship before the breach." Outside the ship. It's colder outside than in when a ship is being destroyed. The cold helped. She said it flatly, without drama, as if describing a maintenance procedure. I rigged the distress device from what I could salvage from the exterior hull access panel. It took me 6 weeks. I wasn't sure it would work. It worked. Yes. Something shifted in her expression, very briefly, before going flat again. I wasn't entirely certain I still wanted it to. Sierra looked at her. But you built it anyway. Another very small pause. I built it anyway. The diplomatic convoy was waiting at the Talonier jump point. 3 ISA vessels carrying representatives from 7 member worlds. The transport ship Dorisville with the Alliance's senior archaeological liaison on board, and a security detail that had been drilling for 6 weeks in preparation for this mission. The mission was simple, officially. A new site had been found at the edge of explored space, ruins of a civilization so old that the dating instruments returned numbers that made the senior archaeologists go very quiet. Simple. A look. A report. A convoy there and back. Duleth had set them back on course for the rendezvous, while Sierra was still in the medical bay. This was one of the things she valued about him. He knew when to stop registering disapproval and simply do what needed doing. She informed him about Kayla in the briefing that followed. She should be transported to Minbar, Duleth said immediately. She's been through significant trauma. She needs medical attention beyond our capabilities. She's been through 8 months on the exterior hull of a dead ship in open space, and her first question was about tactical positioning. She's not fragile. That is not the same as being well. No, Sierra considered this. But she's also the only person who's had direct contact with whatever killed the Terranal, and we're heading toward a location that might be connected to the same thing. I'm not putting her in a diplomatic packet and sending her home without understanding what she knows. Duleth was quiet for a moment. The Council will not. I'll note it in the log and deal with the Council after. She stood. Have someone get her new clothes. Hers are compromised. Kayla stood in the Ardavari's small observation alcove and looked out at the stars with an expression Sierra had seen before, on people coming back from somewhere they hadn't expected to come back from. It was not wonder. It was not relief. It was something more complicated and quieter than either of those, the expression of someone recalibrating their relationship to being alive. Sierra stood beside her. Outside, the convoy had formed up and they were in transit now, the Ardavari holding the rear escort position, Dorisville at center, the 3 ISA vessels spaced around her like a loose fist. The Terranal had been out for 3 days, Kayla said. Her voice was low, unhurried. We received a priority signal from the archaeological team. Their advanced survey vessel had found something that warranted immediate ranger presence. I diverted us to the site. A pause. When we came out of the jump point, they were already there, waiting, as if they knew we were coming. The spy on your ship. The spy on my ship. Something tightened in her jaw. They came out of. I've been trying to find the right word for 8 months, not hyperspace. Hyperspace leaves a jump signature you can read. This was different, like they folded themselves out of somewhere that doesn't have a name, somewhere adjacent to space but not within it. Sierra thought about what the file on the Terranal said, which was almost nothing. Crew lost, cause unknown, investigation ongoing, status unresolved. The kind of bureaucratic language that appeared when the people writing the report didn't have a framework for what had actually happened. You said they, she kept her voice neutral, not a ship, not a force. Kayla turned to look at her. I said they because I mean something that has agency, something that decides. They're ships, they're instruments. I don't know if ships is the right word either. They weren't operating on the logic of our technology. There was no propulsion I could identify. No weapons discharge in any spectrum I could read. They touched the Terranal and the Terranal came apart. She paused. The way you'd tear paper. The stars outside were cold and numerous and completely indifferent. And they kept the ship, Sierra said. They kept the ship. And whatever they were looking for in it, I don't think they found, which is the only reason I think I'm still alive. A very deliberate pause. They searched it for 5 months. I don't know what they were looking for. Sierra did not say what she was thinking, which was, whatever they were looking for, we might be leading them directly to it. Ambassador Ji Ren was the kind of diplomat who filled a room by knowing how to fill it. She was Narn, heavyset, with a face that had done a great deal of living and retained all of it, and she had been the senior alliance representative on more treaty negotiations than anyone still active in the diplomatic corps. She met Sierra in the Dorisful's conference room with the measured courtesy of someone who knew exactly how much she needed to tell you, and had long ago stopped being impressed by rank. "You're 3 hours late," she said without heat. "We made a recovery," Sierra said. She explained. Jiren's expression as she listened moved through several things and settled on something careful and alert. When Sierra was finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "The site we're being taken to," she said finally, "is described in the briefing materials as the oldest structure ever discovered, older than the Vorlons, older than anything the first ones left behind. The archaeologists date it to a period before the current cycle of civilization." A pause. "The people who found it did not report initially because they were afraid of what it might mean. They reported when another expedition failed to return from the site." "Failed to return?" "Vanished." Jiren's eyes were steady. "I have sat in 7 rooms where someone told me the universe was about to change, Commander, and 6 of those times they were wrong. I want you to understand that I am not a person who frightens easily." She paused. "I would like your recovered captain present at all subsequent briefings." Kayla came to the briefings. She sat slightly apart from the diplomatic personnel, which Sierra read partly as the instinct of a soldier in a room full of diplomats, and partly as something else, a watchfulness that went in all directions at once, the posture of someone who had spent 8 months with no allies and had not yet unlearned it. She said little in the first briefing. In the second, when the lead archaeologist, a compact and perpetually anxious Minbari named Selen, was showing the initial survey images from the site, she said, "Stop." Selen stopped. Kayla was looking at a structure in the image, partially excavated from the rock it had been embedded in for however long it had been there. The structure was angular in ways that did not follow any architectural tradition from any known species, and it was large. The scale marker in the corner of the image indicated the visible portion was nearly 300 meters on a side. "I've seen that before," Kayla said. Silence in the room. "Where?" Sierra said. Kayla looked at her. On the exterior of one of their instruments when they were searching the terminal, the same geometry, the same material. She looked back at the image. "They weren't looking for something aboard my ship. They were looking for something about where my ship had been." Selen made a small sound that was somewhere between scientific excitement and terror. "The site," he said very quietly. "The signal the advanced survey vessel reported. We thought it was a technological artifact, something the ruins had been doing for millennia. But if it started recently..." "If it started recently," Jiren said, with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping people complete thoughts they found difficult to finish, "then whatever is coming would be following it to the source." Selen made the sound again, quieter this time. Sierra looked at the image of the structure on the screen, at the geometry that Kayla had seen on the side of something that had torn a ranger ship apart like paper, and felt the particular stillness that came over her when a situation resolved from complicated to clear. "Helm," she said into her communicator, "what's our ETA to the site?" 14 hours, Commander. Reduce speed to 2/3. And begin passive sensor sweeps in all directions, continuous." She paused. "Wake everyone up." Nafili found her in the engine room. Nafili was the Artivari's engineer, a Narn woman of indeterminate age and unambiguous opinion, who had the habit of speaking her mind with a directness that had made her incompatible with every other ship she'd been posted to. She had come to the Artavari because the previous engineer had left under circumstances nobody entirely specified, and Sira had needed someone who could keep an aging ship running with insufficient parts and insufficient budget, and preferred not to be thanked for it. "You want to talk to me?" Naphtali said. It was not a question. "The communications equipment," Sira said. "The Terranol's trader used the communications equipment to lead them in. I want to know if there's anything on this ship, any modification, any addition that wasn't here when we shipped out, that could be used to do the same." Naphtali looked at her steadily. "You think we have one too?" "I think the Terranol thought it was on a routine posting when it went out. I think we're escorting a diplomatic convoy to the most significant site ever discovered, which appears to be directly connected to whatever killed the Terranol's crew." She kept her voice level. "I think if I were trying to find that site, I'd want someone on this ship." Naphtali was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving to the middle distance in the way they did when she was thinking. "I'll need 4 hours." "You have 2. "I'll need 4. Sira left her to it. The modifications were in the diplomatic packet relay. Naphtali found them 90 minutes later, because Naphtali, whatever else she was, did not pace herself when she was looking for something. They were elegant and small, a passive reflector buried in the relay's secondary antenna housing, designed to tag any outgoing transmission with a directional beacon. It had been installed professionally, which meant by someone who understood the equipment. "How long has it been active?" Sira asked. "Since before we shipped out." Naphtali's voice was flat. "At least 3 weeks. The convoy had assembled at Minbar 3 weeks ago." Sira thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Disable it. Don't remove it. I want it to look like it's still working. And then we find out who put it there." She did not say the other thing she was thinking, which was, if it was active while we recovered Kayla, they already know we found her. The finding of who was methodical and careful and took time they could not easily spare, which was the nature of the finding of who. Sira went through the briefing manifests, the boarding logs, the access records for the communications relay housing, the movement of every person on both ships for the 3 weeks prior to departure. She did this with Dulath, who had a gift for pattern recognition that she used deliberately and freely because she was a commander who believed in using what she had. Dulath said at the end of 4 hours, "Minister Kaftan, tell me." He accessed the relay housing 4 times in the week before departure. He is listed in the manifest as communications liaison for the diplomatic delegation. His access to the relay systems was authorized. A pause. He was also, according to records I requested from Minbar archives 2 hours ago, one of 3 officials present at the Terranol's last mission briefing. Sira sat with that for a moment. He knew where the Terranol was going. He knew where the Terranol was going. She thought about Kayla, sealed in a pressure suit, building a distress device out of salvaged cable in the dark. She thought about 11 crew members of the Terranol and what had happened to them. She thought about something that could fold itself out of adjacent space and tear a ship apart with its hands. "Don't move on him yet," she said. "If we move on him, whoever is on the other end of that beacon knows the beacon's been found. I want to do this in the right order." Dulath looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over 2 years as carefully restrained disagreement. "And what is the right order? First, we make sure Kayla is somewhere safe. Then we find out what they think we're bringing them to. Then we give them a reason to come out of wherever they're hiding." She paused. "Then we take their reason away." Kayla found her in the observation alcove again, 3 hours from the site. She had been given ranger fatigues, which fit poorly in the way borrowed clothes always do, and she had the unsettled look of someone who had been sleeping hard for the first time in a long time and hadn't quite reconciled it yet. She leaned against the wall beside Sira, and they both looked out at the stars for a while. You were born in the Corps, Kayla said. It was not quite a question. At 14, Sierra said, I was the youngest of 6. There wasn't much left for me at home. What about you? My mother wanted me in the religious caste. A pause. My mother was wrong about several things. Sierra almost smiled. What made you want the Terranal specifically? She's a patrol ship. Most of the good assignments are were. She was. Kayla said it without inflection, but the correction was careful. I wanted her because she was difficult. The previous commander had requested a transfer after 18 months, citing her as irredeemably contrary. I thought that sounded like a recommendation. Sierra did smile this time. It does. I had her for 4 years. Kayla was quiet for a moment. She never lost a crew member until the last day. Not one in 4 years on patrol, in the outer boundary. She paused. I keep thinking about that, about whether there was something I could have found in the logs or the mission parameters that I missed, some indication. There wasn't, Sierra said. You can't know that. No. But I know what it looks like when someone misses something that was there to be found, and I know what it looks like when someone runs into something that was specifically designed to be missed. Captain was on your mission briefing. He had 3 weeks with the Terranal's route before you shipped out. She paused. He prepared. Kayla was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, quietly, I want to be present when you take him. You will be. And I want, she stopped, started again. I want to be present when we meet whatever is coming, not watching from sickbay. Present. Sierra looked at her, at the shattered crest, at the frost-colored eyes, at the expression of someone who had been through the worst thing and come out the other side still themselves, still asking to be part of whatever came next. You're not cleared for active. I know. Your suit has been through 8 months of space exposure. Your O2 recycler is. I know. A pause. We'll get you re-equipped, Sierra said. They arrived at the site as scheduled, or nearly so, and for approximately 12 minutes it was exactly what the briefing materials had described. Ruins of extraordinary age at the base of a long-dead formation that had once been geological and was now something else, spread across a surface of bare dark rock under a sun that was old enough to be visibly smaller than it should have been, surrounded by the careful equipment and careful people of 3 months of archaeological work. Selen met them on the surface with the air of a person who had been spending time in the presence of something far too large for ordinary reactions, which had led him to a place of pure professional concentration that served as a reasonable substitute for being fine. We've been unable to fully date the primary structure, he said, as he led Sierra and Kayla and Jiren toward the excavation center. But we have dated an organic inclusion in the foundation material, a biological residue, which returned an age of, he paused. The number the instruments return is so large that we've been double-checking it for 6 weeks. We are now confident. How old? Jiren said. Selen said the number. Jiren, who had said she was not easily frightened, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, that predates the current cycle of the universe. Yes, Selen said, we believe so. That's not possible. No. And yet, he gestured toward the structure ahead of them, which was doing what very old things did when you stood near them, which was that it made everything near it feel brief. We have a working theory that what we're looking at is less a construction and more a seal, a device for closing something off from this dimension of space, something that was judged dangerous enough that the beings who created it wanted it inaccessible for as long as the universe needed, Kayla said. Everyone turned to look at her. She was staring at the structure, at its geometry, at the angles that matched what she'd seen on the hull of whatever had killed her crew. You said you didn't know what they were looking for on the Terranal, Sierra said. I said I didn't know. I have had a great deal of time to think about it. Kayla's voice was very steady. If what you're describing is a seal and they are what was sealed away, then they weren't looking for something my ship had. They were looking for what my ship knew, where this was, how to find the thing that had been keeping them out. The ground did not shake. The sky did not darken. Nothing dramatic happened, because in Sierra's experience, the moment when everything changes is never accompanied by appropriate atmospheric effects. Her communicator activated. Kit's voice, "Commander, I'm reading a spatial distortion at bearing 347. I've never seen a reading like this. It's like space is folding in on." He stopped. The distortion on his screen was, Sierra knew, the same thing Kayla had described. The thing that didn't have a name because hyperspace was too simple a word for it, because it was something older than hyperspace, older than the technologies that had built the jump gates, older than the species that had built the jump gates, folding itself out of a place that didn't exist on any chart and hadn't, for longer than civilization had existed to make charts. "Combat stations," Sierra said. There were 3 of them. She got that from Kit's sensor report as she hit the Artivari's bridge at a run. 3 objects, moving in ways that sensors couldn't fully track because their method of movement violated several assumptions baked into the sensor design, converging on the site from different approach vectors. "Hailing frequencies," she said. No response. Kit was working with both hands, pulling data from 3 different panels. "Commander, they're not broadcasting. They're not registering on any active sensor band I'm using. I'm reading them on passive only, which means if they know we're here, they're choosing to respond to us the same way we'd respond to something we've decided isn't relevant." "They think we can't stop them," Duluth said. "They've been sealed away for several billion years," Sierra said. "The last thing they remember is beings who could actually stop them. We're not that." She looked at the screens. The 3 objects were moving toward the site, not toward the ships. "They're not here to fight us. They're here for the seal." "Can we destroy the seal?" Duluth asked. "We destroy that structure," Kayla's voice said. From the doorway, she had followed Sierra to the bridge, which was a thing Sierra noted and decided to address later, specifically by not addressing it. "And we potentially make the situation worse. If it's a seal and we break it, we break it." "Then we don't let them reach it," Sierra said. "With 3 ships and a diplomatic convoy. With what we have," she turned to the weapons console. "Sarah." The weapons officer, Sarah Voss, 26 years old, red-haired, with an energy for combat that her evaluations described as focused in a way that meant something slightly more intense than that, looked up from her panel. "Ready. All weapons free." The problem with fighting something that didn't use conventional propulsion was that its movement was unpredictable in the way that random number generation was unpredictable. Not actually random, but operating on a logic your pattern recognition hadn't been designed for. The 3 objects moved in arcs that violated the mathematics of inertia, appearing where they weren't expected, not quite where the targeting solutions projected. Sarah Voss worked the weapons console the way someone who had been fighting since before she'd been trained for it worked any difficult task, with the whole body, with the particular attention that comes from having lost count of the times it had mattered. The Artivari's weapons system was, by design, linked directly to the combat officer's physical input. An older Ranger philosophy made technology, the belief that a fight should be personal, that the hands that held the weapon should be the hands that aimed it. She fired in patterns, not in single shots, predicting where the objects would be 2 movements from now by working backward from where they appeared to want to go. The first 2 shots went wide. The third clipped the trailing edge of the nearest object and it flinched, actually flinched, altering course in a way that read, on sensors, like pain. "It felt that," Sierra said. "They're not invulnerable." "Just very, very old," Kit said, which was not immediately helpful but was accurate. The problem was the diplomatic convoy. The ISA vessels had begun an emergency extraction protocol, the Dorisville maneuvering toward a safe distance, but safe distance from something that didn't follow conventional movement logic was hard to calculate. and one of the objects had diverted a portion of its attention to the convoy in what read very clearly as either a threat or a warning, and the diplomatic ships were slowing in a way that meant the people on them were trying to figure out which. On the surface below, Sierra knew Selen and his team were doing something she couldn't see from here. She hoped it was useful. She hoped they had something that worked against a seal being approached by what it had been designed to seal. She hoped these were not the wrong hopes to have. The second object was almost to the site. She had 30 seconds. Kayla, she said it without turning from the screen. The structure, you saw their geometry on its surface. You know what they're looking for in it. Kayla was beside her. Sierra felt it rather than saw it. An entrance, Kayla said slowly. They'll be looking for an entrance, a way in, or a way to break it. What breaks it? The same thing that made it. That's how seals work. Something that knows the original design. A pause. I don't know the original design. But the signal does, she returned. The signal the site has been broadcasting since the advance team arrived. The one we thought was a passive artifact. What if it wasn't passive? What if it was a response signal? The seal recognizes that something is searching for it and generates a signal. That could also be the entrance key, Kayla finished. Her voice had changed. If you interrupt the signal, if you break the response mid-cycle, it won't open. It won't open, not unless they have the key themselves, which, she stopped. They weren't looking for my ship. They were looking for the signal. My ship had just come from the site. I was carrying the signal in my comm logs without knowing it. They were trying to extract it. Did they? A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. I don't know. I was outside the hull. Kit, Sierra said, the signal from the site, can you disrupt it from here? Jam it. Jamming won't work. It'll just layer over the signal without interrupting the cycle. I'd need a precise interruption at the correct phase, like cutting a string instead of muffling it. A pause. I can do that, but if I do, I lose our communications until I reset. How long? 3 minutes, maybe 4. 3 or 4 minutes with no communications, no coordination with the convoy, no way to know what was happening on the surface except what she could see. Do it. The signal went dark. The precise, targeted absence of it spread outward from the site at the speed of light, and it was 2 seconds before anything responded. 2 seconds that felt like something much longer than that, and then the nearest object stopped. It stopped in a way that was different from pausing. It stopped in a way that suggested the thing operating it had reached for something it expected to find and found nothing, and that this had produced a response that wasn't quite confusion, because it was too old for confusion in the ordinary sense, but was something adjacent to it, something that had not been in its expectation. The second object, almost at the site, also stopped. The third, which had been threatening the diplomatic convoy, began to move toward the others. They convened. There was no other word for it. They convened around the site at a distance of approximately 800 meters, and then they were still, and the stillness had the quality of a consultation. They're recalculating, Duluth said very quietly. Yes. They'll determine that we interrupted the signal. Yes. And then they will. Yes, Sierra looked at the screen. Sarah. Ready. The moment they move toward the site, not before. I want them to have just started moving when the first shot hits. Sarah nodded. The stillness lasted 40 seconds. Then the 3 objects moved. The first shot hit at 41 seconds. And then it was the kind of thing that is described afterward in after-action reports as a sustained engagement, which was a way of saying that it lasted much longer than felt survivable and required everything every person in the room had. The first exchange of fire lasted 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, Sarah Voss put 9 shots on 3 targets moving in non-inertial patterns at ranges between 200 and 800 meters, hitting the nearest one 3 times, clipping the second, and bracketing the third to force it off its approach vector toward the structure. The Ardavari shuddered under the recoil of its own weapon systems, and the near-miss return fire that passed close enough to heat the hull plating on the starboard quarter. In those same 11 seconds, Kit's hands were moving across 3 panels, tracking objects that his instruments had not been designed to fully read, calling out position updates in a voice that had gone flat and rapid and almost musical, the particular cadence of someone feeding data fast enough that rhythm replaced syntax. Lead at 270 closing. Second bearing 185, altitude dropping. Third has broken off. It's going for the convoy bearing. Ignore the third, Sira said. The convoy can run. We cannot leave the site. It was, she knew, the kind of decision that looked different depending on where you stood. From the bridge of the Dorisville, it would look like she was leaving the diplomatic ships exposed. From the site, it would look like she was doing the only thing that mattered. Both views would be correct. Command was the act of choosing which correct view to act on, and living with the other one afterward. The Ardavari came about hard. The port thruster tremor she'd been living with for 8 months, suddenly irrelevant compared to the forces the ship was moving through. And Sira felt the familiar shift in her center of gravity that meant the inertial dampeners were being asked to do things the engineering specs said they could do, but which they clearly had opinions about. Sarah Voss worked the weapons console with the ferocity and precision of someone fighting the most difficult thing she had ever fought, and the Ardavari moved with her. Sira kept the ship turning, presenting angles, denying the objects any single approach vector, using the wreckage of 2 earlier near misses to seed a debris field that complicated their movement logic. Naphtali, in engineering, was maintaining thrust outputs that exceeded the rated maximum on 3 separate systems, and maintaining a running commentary through the shipcom that was technically a status report and practically several things that would have been inappropriate in diplomatic company, which was fine because the diplomats were all on the Dorisville. At some point during the engagement, Sira couldn't have said when exactly, because time during combat folded into itself in ways that made chronology unreliable. The Ardavari took a direct hit along the ventral hull that killed the secondary power coupling and dropped the lights on the lower deck to emergency amber. Naphtali's commentary shifted in pitch and volume and specificity, in a way that Sira had learned to interpret as genuine concern rather than theatrical concern, and then shifted back as the backup coupling engaged, which Naphtali had apparently pre-wired during the approach because she was the kind of engineer who prepared for failures she hadn't been told to prepare for. Holding, Naphtali reported. Then, under her breath but audible on the open comm, "You miserable, beautiful, stubborn piece of..." She was talking to the ship. She always talked to the ship. The ship, in Naphtali's cosmology, was a living thing that responded to direct emotional address, and whatever anyone else thought about that methodology, the Ardavari was still flying. Kayla stood at the secondary nav console and tracked the object's movement with the focused attention of someone who had spent 8 months watching them and understood, better than anyone on this ship, the grammar of the way they moved. "The lead one," she said. "It's taking hits and routing the damage to the right side. The right side is where they regenerate, if you stop hitting the left." "Sarah." "Left side only," Sarah said. Starting, she moved, now. The lead object's course changed. It moved to protect its left side, which exposed its right, which Sira had guessed was damaged in a way they hadn't been willing to show. "Now hit the right," she said. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah was already there. The lead object came apart in a way that bore no resemblance to conventional weapons destruction. It didn't explode. It unraveled, its geometry collapsing inward in a sequence that looked almost deliberate, like something making a final decision about itself. The other 2 stopped again. "They're doing the same thing as before," Dulath said. "No," Kayla said. "They're not recalculating." There, she was looking at the sensor data with an expression Sira had never seen on a Minbari face before, which was a kind of fierce, reluctant recognition. They're deciding whether we're worth fighting. The silence that followed lasted 32 seconds. Then the two remaining objects folded themselves back into whatever place they came from, in the same way they had arrived, not retreating, not fleeing, but choosing, in the deliberate way of something very old that has learned the particular costs of miscalculation, to go. The sensor board went quiet. Nafili's commentary in engineering stopped mid-word. Kit said, in a voice that sounded like he was surprised to still be using it, "They're gone." Nobody on the bridge said anything for a moment. Then Kayla said very quietly, "They'll come back." "Yes," Sira said. "They were sealed away before and someone else did it. We can't." "No. So what do we?" "We go home," Sira said. "We tell them what happened. We show them the geometry that matches the structure on the surface. We give them Kaftan and we give them the logs from the Terranal, and we let the people with the resources and the centuries of knowledge about things like this start working on a solution." She paused. "That's what we can do. It's not nothing." Kayla was quiet for a moment. Then, "No. It's not nothing." Between the battle and the jump home, there was a stretch of hours that had the quality of borrowed time. The kind of hours that exist after something terrible has almost happened, and before the practical requirements of having survived it catch up. The crew of the Artavari moved through these hours in their different ways. Nafili stayed in engineering, which was where she always went when she needed to be useful with her hands. Kit filed preliminary reports in the meticulous, almost soothing way that made Sira suspect he'd been the kind of child who organized things when anxious. Duleth stood in the corridor outside the bridge at parade rest, which was his method, a stillness so complete it looked like a decision rather than a posture. Sarah Voss came to Sira in the small command alcove off the bridge, which Sira used for the paperwork she preferred no one to see her doing, and sat in the chair on the other side of the desk without being invited, which was a thing Sarah did with the naturalness of someone who had never found social convention particularly compelling. "How's your arm?" Sira said, without looking up from the report she was writing. "Fine." A pause. "Cracked the panel facing during the last sequence. Kept the angle, though." "You kept the angle. That was the shot that stopped the second one from reaching the structure." "Yes." Sarah said it simply, without false modesty or performance. She was good at what she did, and she knew it, and she didn't need to be told, but she listened when you did. The hit pattern, the way the lead one rooted damage, Kayla read that correctly. Military instinct. 8 months on a dead ship in open space, Sira said. Whatever she had when she went out there, she kept it. More than kept it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I watched her during the engagement on the secondary nav board. She was reading their movement patterns before the sensors were in a couple of instances. A pause. Whatever they were doing when they searched the Terranal, when they were looking for the signal, she was watching it happen. For 5 months. She learned the way they move from watching them work. Sira set down the report. You're saying she has information we don't have logged anywhere. I'm saying her debriefing is going to be a very long conversation, and whoever runs it should be someone she trusts enough to give them the full version, rather than the version that fits on a standard report template. Sira looked at her. Since when do you read people this carefully? I always read people this carefully, Sarah said, without defensiveness. I just usually don't find it worth mentioning. She stood. The report needs the combat log from the weapons panel. I'll have it to you in the hour. She left without ceremony, which was also her method. Sira sat for a moment with the half-written report and the particular quiet of the Artavari in transit, the hum of the ship that she had, over 2 years, learned to read the way some people read the weather, which systems were stressed, which were running easy, what the deep vibration of the engines was telling her about the state of things. The ship sounded, currently, like something that had been through a great deal and was still operating, which was all you could ask of anything. She wanted to deal with Kaftan. He was in the Dorisful's observation lounge. Not the brig. Jiren had made the decision that confining him formally before the hearings would complicate the diplomatic framing of the mission's outcome, which was a calculation Sira respected without entirely agreeing with. He was under escort, which was 2 rangers from the Dorisful security detail and one of Sira's own people, Duleth Jr., a quiet Minbari named Valen who had a gift for standing in a room in a way that communicated clearly that nothing was going to happen that he didn't want to happen. Kaftan was seated at the far end of the lounge. He was human, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that had been carefully arranged into neutral pleasantness so many times that it had settled into that expression as a default. He was looking at the stars outside the port when Sira walked in. He did not startle when she closed the door. He had been expecting her. "You want to know why?" he said. He didn't phrase it as a question. "I know why," Sira said. She sat down across from him. "Or I know the category of why. Someone offered you something, or threatened something, or both. You made a calculation that the Terranal and 11 Rangers and whatever might happen to the site and everyone at it were worth whatever you were getting or keeping." She paused. "I don't need the specific contents of that calculation right now. That's for the hearings." Kaftan looked at her. Something shifted in the careful blankness of his face, not quite guilt, but the specific expression of someone reassessing what this conversation was going to be. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to know if you transmitted after we found Captain Kayla." A pause, longer than it should have been. "The beacon was passive," he said, "directional but not controllable on my end. I couldn't." "That's not what I asked." The pause again. "Then, I had a secondary communication method, narrowband high compression. I transmitted once, yes." "After we found her?" "After you found her," he looked at the table. "I transmitted that she was alive, that she was aboard." Sira sat with that for a moment. "So they knew. Before we reached the site, they knew she was recovered and was with us." "Yes." "And they came to the site anyway." "They always intended to come to the site. Finding her," he stopped. "She had something they wanted. I don't know exactly what. They were less specific about that with me than you might imagine. I was a means to an end, not a partner." The word partner carried a weight of something that might have been bitterness. "Finding her may have been an additional incentive, yes." Sira looked at him steadily. "She knew you." Kaftan looked up. "She was at the Terranal's mission briefing. You were there. She may not remember your face among all the faces in a diplomatic briefing, but she'll remember when she's shown the roster." Sira paused. "You were in that briefing when her crew was still alive, before you gave her ship's route to the people who killed them." Kaftan looked back at the table. He said nothing. "The hearings will be thorough," Sira said. She stood. "I'm told you're comfortable enough in here. I recommend staying that way." She left him with the stars and the silence and whatever he was doing with his thoughts, which was no longer her problem. They locked down Kaftan and the Dorisful's brig without incident, which disappointed Sira slightly. She had been prepared for a more complicated confrontation, and found herself with a surplus of preparation and no place to put it. He sat in the detention space and did not look at her directly and said nothing at all, which was a kind of information. Jiren came to her afterward, in the Ardavari's small common room, with 2 cups of something that smelled like tea and might have been. "There will be hearings," Jiren said. "When we return, the council will want a full account. The diplomatic corps will want a full account. The archaeologists will want," she paused, "the archaeologists will want to go back." "They can't go back yet." "No," Jiren looked into her cup. "There will be people who question how a single patrol ship and a diplomatic convoy turned back." She stopped, started again. "I want you to know, before those hearings, that I will tell them exactly what I saw. which was a commander who made correct decisions in a situation that provided very little foundation for correct decisions. Sira looked at her. "Thank you." "I am not thanking you," Jiren said, with a precision that was almost gentle. "I am informing you, there is a difference." Sira almost smiled. "There is." The Ardavari made the jump to hyperspace as the sun at the site went from a small cold disk to a point of light to nothing at all, and Kit dialed up the ship's standard travel lighting, which was slightly warmer than combat lighting, and made the bridge feel, for a moment, like something designed for living in rather than surviving in. Duleth appeared at Sira's elbow. "Your log entry," he said. "The Council will note your decision to retain Captain Kayla aboard." "Yes." "They will note the decision to deviate from the mission parameters to investigate the signal." "Yes." "They may consider the engagement to have been." "Duleth," she turned to look at him, "when you spoke on my behalf when I first got this ship," she paused. Because this was one of the things she didn't normally discuss. "You told the review board that I would live as well as die for the mission, that I understood the full scope of what the oath meant." Duleth was quiet for a moment. "I recall." "Were you right?" He looked at her with the measured consideration of someone who had been asked this question about a person for a second time, and was comparing the first assessment to current evidence. "Yes," he said, "I believe I was." Kayla was in the observation alcove when Sira found her, in the hour after the jump, with the blue-white of hyperspace moving outside the port. She was sitting on the floor rather than standing, her back against the wall, knees up, the way you sit when you have been performing uprightness for long enough that you need to stop for a moment. Sira sat beside her on the floor. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, hyperspace moved in its complex undulations, which looked like currents if you were in a poetic mood and looked like physics if you were not, and were actually the same thing. "Do you know what I kept thinking about?" Kayla said, not as a question, more as something that had been waiting to be said. "During the 8 months, there was a piece of music my mother used to play. She was in the religious caste, so she played it as part of services, but I always thought it sounded to me like something that described open space, like it was written for this." She gestured vaguely toward the hyperspace outside. "I used to catch myself humming it when I was doing hull work. When I got tired, when I didn't have anything else left, I would hum it, very quietly, into the suit." Sira listened. "I don't know what it says about the Minbari that our religious music sounds like open space," Kayla said. "Maybe nothing, maybe everything." "I think it says you were always going to be out here," Sira said. Kayla was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that was, very quietly, a kind of laugh, not bitter, not relieved. Something in between that had been waiting for a long time for the right context. "We live in starlight," she said. "The Ranger Oath, the first part of it, the part that wasn't about dying. We come from the stars in life." Sira said the second half, "And we return to the stars in death." "Not yet," Kayla said. "No," Sira said, "not yet." They sat together in the blue-white glow and did the thing that was, in its own way, the most human thing either of them could have done at that moment, which was nothing at all. They sat and breathed and let the silence be the silence, and did not fill it with analysis or plans or the particular anxieties of people who had just done something extraordinary, and were not yet sure how they felt about it. After a while, Kayla began to hum. It was very quiet, barely audible over the ship's ambient systems, over the low pulse of the jump engines, over the distant sound of Naphtali doing something emphatic to a relay junction 2 decks down. It was not a tune Sira recognized. It had the quality of something very old, something that had been composed for spaces larger than the room it was being hummed in, and Kayla hummed it the way you hum something that has kept you company for a long time in a place where company was hard to find. Sira listened. She did not ask what it was. Some things you could learn by asking, and some things you could only learn by listening, and the difference between the two was one of the things that separated people who understood people from people who merely studied them. Outside, hyperspace kept moving, complex and cold, and full of things that didn't have names yet. In the engine room, Naphtali was extracting Kaftan's beacon and cursing at it personally, which was her method of processing things. In the cockpit, Kit was running his standard post-combat diagnostic and humming something tuneless to himself, unaware that 2 decks away someone else was humming too. In the weapons bay, Sarah Voss was cleaning the weapons console with more care than it strictly needed, running her fingers along the input surfaces that had, hours ago, been the only thing between the oldest structure ever discovered and something that wanted to unmake it. She cleaned methodically, the way she did everything, not ritualistically, but with the focused attention of someone who believed that the tools you fought with deserved to be treated as if they mattered, because they did. Dulath was on the bridge, standing watch. He would stand watch for 4 more hours without being asked, because that was the kind of officer he was, and because he understood that the hours after a thing like this were the hours when the commander needed to not be on the bridge, needed to be somewhere doing something that looked like nothing but was actually the work of being a person rather than a rank. The Ardavari moved through the blue-white deep, older than she looked and carrying everything she needed to carry, and the stars on the other side of the jump were patient, the way stars always were, the way they had been patient for longer than anything currently alive could meaningfully contemplate. They would get home. They would tell the story. They would come back. That was the thing about humans, and about everyone who had learned to be human in the ways that mattered, which had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the specific refusal to stop. That was the thing, the very old things, the sealed-away things that had been alone in adjacent darkness for longer than civilizations existed, consistently miscalculated. They kept forgetting that we came back. Sierra leaned her head against the wall and listened to the hum of the ship around her. The particular hum of this ship, this one, with its port thruster tremor and its too-warm corridor C and its engineer who cursed at machinery as a form of affection, and closed her eyes for a moment. Tomorrow there would be hearings and reports, and the long bureaucratic exhale of institutions processing something they didn't have a category for yet. Tonight there was the deep and the hum and the breathing of 11 people who had, against what the odds had suggested, made it to another day. It was enough. It was, in fact, a great deal more than enough.